Do you believe there was an Exodus? Were the children of Israel really slaves in Egypt until a series of plagues allowed them to leave and eventually become the nation of Israel? Most Christians and Jews believe this event happened, but many Egyptologists and scholars doubt the story the book of Exodus records. Instead, some suggest it was just a myth that was invented by later scribes to give Israel a claim to the land of Canaan and a reason to motivate a return from their later exile in Babylon. Many archaeologists also say we have little to no evidence that would support an exodus from Egypt during the Late Bronze Age. So until we find evidence, there is no reason to assume it happened. But perhaps the reason we cannot find it is because we've been looking for it in the wrong time period. During another period in Egypt, we find evidence of religious turmoil, acts of desperation, a drastic change in Egyptian policy, and peculiar animal graves. There is a lesser-known pharaoh that had several anomalies correlate with his reign that surprisingly fit very well with an exodus of Semites from Egypt. The story of the Exodus is as follows. After Joseph died, at some point a new pharaoh came to power, who did not know about Joseph. He and his dynasty enslaved the Hebrews and forced them to make bricks and construct buildings. Specifically, they built store cities called Pithom and Ramesses. As time went on, the Hebrews grew in size. To deal with the growing population, the Egyptians threw the male infants of the Hebrews into the Nile. One woman saved her son by placing him in a reed basket and floating him down the Nile, where he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. He was named Moses and raised by the Pharaoh's daughter with the royal family. When he grew up, he was troubled by his people in slavery. But after killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, he had to flee to Arabia. But many years later, after all who wanted him dead had passed away, it is said that God appeared to him and commissioned him to go back to Egypt to lead the Hebrews out of slavery. But the Pharaoh at that time was stubborn and prideful. He refused to let the Hebrews leave. So God sent plagues upon Egypt to not only punish the Egyptians, but to demonstrate his power over the Egyptian gods. After the 10th plague, which is when all of the firstborn of Egypt were struck down, including the Pharaoh's own son, the Hebrews were allowed to leave. But the Pharaoh soon changed his mind and led an army to retrieve the Hebrews and bring them back to Egypt. At the edge of the Red Sea, the Pharaoh caught up to the Hebrews, but God sent a strong east wind to blow the sea back all night, opening a path for the Hebrews to cross to the other side. The Egyptian army pursued them, but once all the Hebrews crossed, God allowed the winds to die, and the waters came back, destroying the army and all their chariots. Thus Israel's exodus from Egypt had been fulfilled, as God promised. So what we can look for in the Egyptian archaeological record is a time when there were foreign Semitic slaves in Egypt, around the site known as Ramesses, which was suddenly abandoned. This would most likely have caused a sudden need for a new slave labor force in Egypt, as well as possibly a demand for new chariots. The plagues would likely have caused a decline in Egyptian power and their military might, as well as potential religious turmoil, given that scholars note the plagues were meant to also be judgment on the Egyptian gods. Evidence should also reveal that the pharaoh at the time was considered merciless, prideful, and arrogant, and whoever succeeded him could not have been his oldest son. So if it exists, this should be sufficient evidence to match what the book of Exodus says, and support the historical reality of the Exodus. Most scholars who believe the Exodus is an historical event suggest it happened under Ramesses II, given that Exodus mentions the city Ramesses. We know where this city is, and we know it was most likely not called Ramesses until the 19th dynasty. However, referring to this site as Ramesses could just be an updated place name, like how it is used in Genesis and how there are also other updated place names. Plus, not many of the correlations we should expect to find show up under Ramesses, or at all during the 19th dynasty. But we can find a much better match at an earlier date, under a different pharaoh. Now the Bible says the Exodus happened 480 years before Solomon began constructing the temple. But this estimate comes from the late Masoretic texts. The Greek Septuagint says it was 440 years. Either way, this would place the Exodus around the 15th century BC, long before Ramesses II. Scholars note the Hebrews tended to use idealized numbers to mark things. As Christine Hayes once said, the Hebrews liked round numbers. So this is probably a general estimate of when the Exodus happened. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 480 or 440 years before Solomon's temple. But given that Judges 11 says that during the time of Jephthah, Israel had already been in the land of Canaan for about 300 years, both are probably just general estimates for when the Exodus happened, instead of it being entirely irrelevant for dating the Exodus. But getting an exact date is unlikely to happen. This is also compounded by the fact that Egyptian chronology is not set in stone, and Egyptologists still debate within a few decades about when certain pharaohs began to reign. Most either hold to high chronology or low chronology. But even within that, dates are still debatable by a few decades or so. I say all this to note that there is some wiggle room when it comes to biblical and Egyptian chronology. So we don't have to worry about exact dating, but should instead focus on the general time period. But what should primarily concern us is the evidence itself. If there was more or better evidence for an Exodus in another time period, that should be our primary witness, and biblical dates should be secondary to this, since scholars have shown that biblical numbers can be idealized instead of exact dates or quantities. However, we can start with the general estimate given by the biblical text and see what we find. Also, there are other cases for the Exodus in later and earlier time periods. But for the purpose of this documentary, I won't have time to cover them in depth, and instead, I'll focus on the case I'm presenting. So, this would mean the Exodus likely took place during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and the political situation in Egypt correlates well with the biblical record. First, the events that lead up to the Exodus match well with the political changes in Egypt at this time. To recap, remember in previous videos, we have noted the life of Abraham and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah align with the Middle Bronze Age too. This then places Joseph in the second intermediate period, when the Hyksos, or 15th dynasty, ruled Egypt. Now notice what Exodus 1 begins with. It says a new pharaoh came to power who did not know about Joseph. This can fit with the political changes at the end of the second intermediate period, when the native Egyptians took back control of Egypt and kicked out the foreign Hyksos rulers. The new 18th dynasty of Egypt despised the Hyksos and tried to wipe them out of history. And they were pretty successful in removing the records of their accomplishments and acts. But furthermore, they would not have cared if the Hyksos saved Egypt through years of famine. They considered the Hyksos to be an embarrassment on the Egyptian legacy. Also, Exodus says the Egyptians were worried the Semitic Hebrews might join with their enemies. If the 18th dynasty had just kicked out the Semitic Hyksos, it would make sense they would worry that the Semites they had just seized power over might join with the Hyksos to regain control of Egypt. The fears of the Egyptians that the book of Exodus mentions seems to fit with the rise of the new 18th dynasty, trying to maintain control over their new kingdom and worrying about a possible counterattack from Semitic people. Next, the book of Exodus also notes the Egyptians worried the Hebrews were increasing too much in numbers. This fits well with the cultural context of the time period. The common belief was the Hyksos takeover of Egypt was a sudden invasion from the north. But the archaeological record suggests the Hyksos were in Egypt long before the start of their dynasty, and their takeover may have been a gradual shift due to changes in population sizes. Throughout the Middle Kingdom, we have evidence of Asiatics moving into and settling in Egypt. Over time, they seem to have just become the dominant power in Lower Egypt and took over. Manfred Bietek suggests the Hyksos should be understood within a repetitive pattern of the attraction of Egypt for Western Asiatic population groups that came in search of a living in the country, especially the Delta, since prehistoric times. Now let's fast forward back to the rise of the New Kingdom, when the native Egyptians regained control of Egypt. It would make sense, as Exodus records, that they would worry about history repeating itself, and Asiatic peoples living in Egypt overpopulating and taking control again. So forcing the Hebrews into slavery and hard living conditions, as well as trying to keep their population in check, would also make sense with this time period. Also, around this time, we have a depiction on the tomb of Reichmir, which shows foreign slaves involved in brickmaking. Later texts also make reference to slaves being used in making bricks. So slaves working as brickmakers, as Exodus records, also fits with the time period of the 18th dynasty. So what we see with the Bible records, as to what led up to the Exodus, fits well with the fall of the Hyksos and the rise of the 18th dynasty. Now, the first part of the 18th dynasty was massively successful, with multiple campaigns into Canaan and Nubia. Massive building projects were also conducted, and there was an expansion of Egypt's power and wealth. One of the richest pharaohs who ever lived reigned during this time period, Thutmose III. He also had one of the longest reigns, when on multiple campaigns expanded Egypt's territory and utilized slave labor in several building projects. He was also one of the greatest contributors to the arts and monuments in Egyptian history. Egypt under Thutmose III reached one of its highest points ever. But all that ended within a decade once his son took the throne, Amenhotep II. Egyptologists note several anomalies with regard to his reign that individually don't amount to much, but combined, they line up with the circumstantial evidence we should expect to find if there was an exodus from Egypt. One of the biggest anomalies is about 10 years into his reign, he broke from his father's warlike policy, as well as his own, and the evidence suggests he signed a peace treaty with one of his biggest rivals, the Mitanni Empire, and he also sought peace with the surrounding nations. The reason why this is odd is because the previous policies of the 18th dynasty were mostly conquest and war. Thutmose III expanded Egypt's territory through vassal kingdoms and campaigned deep into Mitanni territory, clashing with them time and time again. Amenhotep appears to have wanted to continue this policy during the first part of his reign. One of his campaigns was most likely launched after the death of his father. He put down rebellions in Canaan and antagonized the Mitanni Empire. Some scholars suggest the primary aim of this campaign was the conquest of Mitanni itself. Peter Dermanulian says, despite Thutmose III's military success, Mitanni remained Egypt's primary adversary in Dynasty 18, and there is no reason to doubt her continued aggressive policy in the reign of the young king Amenhotep II. However, during Amenhotep's first campaign, putting down rebellions in Canaan and maintaining power there seemed to take up most of their efforts, preventing any further engagements with Mitanni. Amenhotep also displayed his warlike nature early in his reign. Gary Shaw says he inherited his father's love of war and emphasized his brutality more so than other pharaohs. Donald Redford notes he deported 7 chiefs to Egypt and may have personally executed them. One stele records, His Majesty returned in joy of heart to his father Amon, when he had slain with his own mace the 7 princes who had been in the district of Takishi. Then 6 men of these enemies were hanged on the face of the wall of Thebes, and the hands as well. Then the other foe was taken upstream to the land of Nubia and hang to the wall of Napata. Gary Shaw says, the emphasis placed on the action of the king himself, along with the believable description of the king executing prisoners, suggests that the king did indeed perform the actions described. Shaw also notes, during his last campaign in the Levant, he rounded up prisoners into a massive pit and watched them burn alive. Amenhotep II's marked brutalities in his texts are unusual enough to be truthful accounts of events. These are personal, unusual statements which do not follow the typical, formulaic language. Mashe Munich says that Amenhotep adopted a violent war god called Reshef into the pantheon and praised him for helping him with his campaigns. He says, undoubtedly, from the point of view of Amenhotep II's court, the most important characteristic of Reshef was the warlike spirit of the Syrian deity. Such a god was a proper guardian of military campaigns of the young, impetuous pharaoh. Reshef is depicted as a menacing deity able to send death. Amenhotep II boasts of crossing the Orontes with his army, like Reshef. Gary Shaw adds that Amenhotep also likened himself to the Egyptian war god Montu. So it appears Amenhotep was quite bloodthirsty and wanted to be like his father in carrying out war and conquest. This is also consistent with his overall character. Scholars routinely note Amenhotep was very arrogant and boastful. Donald Redford speaks of his bombast and braggart nature. Gary Shaw notes he bragged about his own athletic abilities. James Pritchard says Amenhotep II gloried in his reputation for personal strength and prowess. His records therefore contrast with those of his predecessor and father, Thutmose III, and emphasizing individual achievement. Other scholars observe, Amenhotep, more than any other pharaoh, set up monuments to glorify his personal valor, passing over, however, some of the major but less complimentary events of his campaigns, especially his defeats. So what we have is a very arrogant and prideful pharaoh, who wanted to boast of his prowess and warlike nature. Egyptian pharaohs were pretty arrogant as it was, but Egyptologists often note that Amenhotep stood out as extremely arrogant and more so than the other rulers. Now, not only does this fit with the description of the pharaoh Moses would have been dealing with, but it also seems to be a complete reversal of the policies Amenhotep pursued later during his reign. If his initial goals were conquest and glorifying his personal valor, and if his father set him up with one of Egypt's richest and most powerful time periods, why completely reverse this and pursue peace with your biggest enemies? Donald Redford also notes the way the Egyptian inscriptions word these peace talks suggests this was something out of place. The amplification of the stock phrases that open the pericope, together with the insistence that this was a unique event, suggests that a certain kernel of truth is concealed beneath the hyperbole. Amanda Padani says in a dramatic transformation, his reign became remarkably peaceful, notable for the many buildings he constructed. He seems to have agreed to a peace treaty with Mitanni, surprising though that may seem given the history of hostilities between the two lands. Gary Shaw says, it is unclear why relations suddenly improved between Egypt and each of these great powers. The rationale for the treaty when it comes to Mitanni makes sense. The Hittites were growing in size and becoming a threat to Mitanni. Securing Egypt as an ally would help protect against this. But Redford notes the rationale for Egypt signing a treaty is a little less clear. There is no doubt that Egypt's own interests would have been served by such a treaty, although the pharaonic state of the 18th dynasty could more easily than Mitanni sustain the expense of periodic military incursions 800 kilometers into Asia. In other words, Egypt was not really threatened by the Hittites, given how much further they were and the terrain the Hittites would have had to cross. Plus, As we have noted, Thutmose III gave Egypt one of its richest and most successful periods. There is no reason to fear invasion from the east, given their military might and geographical location. And Amenhotep's initial motives seem to have been the opposite of pursuing peace. Gary Shaw says, "We cannot know if making peace with the Hittites, Mitanni, and the Babylonians was the aim of Amenhotep's or something that he accepted begrudgingly as a political necessity. By making treaties, he would now have to accept these former enemies as brothers, an admission of equality that would seem out of character for Amenhotep. Nonetheless, if it is accepted that these treaties date to Amenhotep's reign, they are the first that the Egyptians ever entered into with foreign states." A more likely thing for Egypt to have done, at the height of its empire, would have been to take Mitanni on as a vassal in exchange for protection against the Hittites. Egypt had already been pursuing a policy in Canaan of ruling through vassal kingdoms. If Mitanni needed protection, this seems like a sensible thing to do. In other words, it's hard to see what Egypt gained from this treaty. The Egyptian inscriptions do speak of the other nations coming and paying tribute to Amenhotep, but Egyptologists see this as propaganda to help make Amenhotep look greater than he was. The evidence suggests a treaty was signed between these great nations, not Mitanni and the other nations becoming vassals or accepting the rulership of Egypt. Treaties imply that both sides need peace and protection. Becoming a vassal is what tended to happen when only one side needed peace and protection, and there is no evidence Mitanni, the Nubians, or the Hittites were threatening to invade Egypt anytime soon. Another explanation is Egypt may have experienced some sort of internal calamity that caused a sudden decrease in power and wealth, causing them to necessarily seek peace with their biggest rivals, instead of continuing to wage costly wars against them. Egypt seems to have been severely weakened, which caused Amenhotep to change his mentality and pursue a policy of peace, which would correlate with the idea the Exodus took place during this time period. Egypt was afflicted by plagues and lost a massive workforce, forcing them to change their policy from war and conquest to peace. Claude van der Sluwen even admits, "It seems possible to consider this reign as unsuccessful, a time of decline, a few exploits abroad, a few preserved memorials, an almost complete absence of sources after the 9th year of his reign." This is also supported by one of the Amarna letters, which suggests Egypt had become much weaker in this time period. Letter 109 reads, "Previously, on seeing a man from Egypt, the kings of Canaan fled before him, but now the sons of Abdi Asirta make the men of Egypt prowl about like dogs. Death would be sweet to me." Van der Sluwen notes after Amenhotep II, Egypt went through a period of military inertness that lasted up until the time of Horemheb. There were a few campaigns under Thutmose IV, but these do not seem to be conquests, but mere policing operations in Canaan and one raid into Nubia. Gary Shaw says that the 18th dynasty empire building phase was over, and the great battles had dried up. Pritchard notes, some of the places that Thutmose IV claimed to have conquered were already in the list of Amenhotep II and Thutmose III, so he was most likely exaggerating in speaking of places he conquered. Peter Clayton also notes about these campaigns is that they may have been rather low-key policing excursions rather than full-blown military attacks. There is little evidence to suggest Egypt remained as strong as it was militarily, like it was when Thutmose III was alive. And the drastic change seems to have happened under Amenhotep II, without a clear explanation as to why. However, if Egypt experienced devastating plagues, the loss of a large slave workforce, and a portion of their army drowned in the Red Sea, this would explain the sudden political changes and the military weakening. There is also evidence to support this in the last campaign launched by Amenhotep II. One stele records that Amenhotep had a 3rd-year campaign. Another records that he had a 7th-year campaign and a 9th-year campaign. A problem arises because the 2nd stele records that the 7th-year campaign was his first victorious campaign. There are numerous proposed solutions to this. Some scholars seem to imply the 2nd stele just have a mistake, and he really had 3 campaigns. Albrecht Alt suggested the 3rd-year campaign was actually one of Thutmose III's campaigns, and Amenhotep was still a co-regent. Shmuel Yavin believes it wasn't really a campaign, but just a local disturbance. James Pritchard suggests the 7th year and the 3rd-year campaign are really the same event. One just counts from when Amenhotep began reigning as a co-regent with his father, and the second counts from when he was the sole ruler. Claude van der Sluwen and Douglas Petrovich point out the 2nd stele are 19th dynasty restorations, and they may have just written the wrong year. In other words, there really was no 7th year campaign. Any of these solutions are fine. I tend to favor the 2-campaign hypothesis of either Pritchard or van der Sluwen, but it is not a hill worth dying on. Nonetheless, for the purposes of this documentary, I'll refer to his 3rd-year campaign and the 7th-year campaign as one and the same as his first campaign, and the 9th-year campaign as his second. Now, the first campaign was launched in the spring, which was typical of most Egyptian campaigns. Der Manulian notes this was the usual time for conquest to be launched. Amenhotep II put down rebellions and antagonized the Mitanni Empire. The second campaign during his 9th year is unusual. First, it was launched in the fall. Pritchard notes this is an unusual season for an Egyptian campaign into Asia. Fall was a bad time for Egypt to be launching a campaign, because it meant you'd be fighting through the cold and rainy winter. You would only do this if it was absolutely necessary. Van der Sluwen says, the second Asiatic campaign began on the 25th day of the 3rd month of the 9th year, during an unusual season for military campaigns. It was probably induced by the necessity of urgent intervention. The second oddity of this campaign is they did not go far. They stayed south of the Sea of Galilee in territories that Egypt already had control over. And finally, and most importantly, the primary purpose of this campaign seems to have been taking captives back to serve as slaves. Egypt, for some odd reason, needed a bunch of additional new slaves. The amount of the captives they took is vastly larger to what we see in previous campaigns. He claims he brought back over 100,000 prisoners of war. In his previous campaign, he only brought back around 2,000 prisoners. In the prior campaigns of Thutmose III, we also see far less than what Amenhotep brought back in his 9th year. Most scholars believe the 100,000 is an exaggeration, but a more conservative estimate still would place the amount at a much higher level than what we see in previous campaigns. Also peculiar, a secondary purpose of this campaign seems to have been obtaining new chariots and weapons. The inscription records he brought back 1,000 new chariots and over 13,000 weapons of war. So to recap, Amenhotep launched the campaign at an unusual time in the fall, which van der Sluwen notes suggests a sense of desperation. They didn't attack rival empires like before, but stayed close to Egypt's main border, and their goal seems to have been gaining a new slave workforce, new chariots, and weapons. Remember something important. The book of Exodus says Israel left Egypt in the spring. So if the Exodus happened earlier that same year, and Egypt lost an entire slave labor force, as well as several chariots in the Red Sea, this 9th year campaign in the fall would fit right in and explain why Amenhotep desperately needed to gather new slaves and new chariots. If an Exodus didn't happen earlier that year, you would think that gathering extra weapons and chariots, as well as a new slave workforce that would free up native Egyptians to serve in the army, would be a reason to launch more campaigns northeast against Mitanni or the Hittite Empire. However, as we noted, the exact opposite happened. Amenhotep the warmongering king who worshipped the violent war gods Reshef and Montu decided to seek peace with his biggest rivals and treated them like equals. Plus, as we also see, Egypt entered a time of military inertness and weakened after this. However, seeking peace, military inertness, needing new slaves and chariots would be what we would expect if an exodus took place and the country was devastated by plagues. But there's still more to look at. You would think that if an exodus didn't happen, this would be a time for celebration in Egypt. Thutmose III had delivered a golden age. Amenhotep had just returned with thousands of new captives to serve Egypt. The Egyptian gods should be celebrated for this time of abundance. However, we see the exact opposite. Gary Shaw notes an anomaly of one inscription of Amenhotep II. It reads, "His person commands to his august ones, the officials of the royal court, the courtiers who can enter the palace, the servants of the good God, to destroy all the images of the gods, their bodies, Amun-Ra." Shaw notes this act of destroying the statues and images of the gods does not have a satisfactory explanation. The reference to destroying the images of the gods has not been satisfactorily explained. It seems that Amenhotep needed to act judgment on his own gods, even after they had brought Egypt so much wealth and power. He suggests it may refer to the act of fashioning new cult images. But Douglas Petrovich points out that what Egyptologists fail to explain candidly is that it would seem impossible for a pharaoh to issue a decree for his courtiers to destroy the statues of the Egyptian gods that were in the temples, since the establishment of statues in the temples was a common practice during the dynastic period. So it probably doesn't refer to a mere commission of constructing new cult images, as that would likely have been the job of the devotees, as Emily Teeter noted. It better fits with the idea of religious turmoil in Egypt, when the pharaoh felt the need to enact judgment on the Egyptian gods. Douglas Petrovich also notes the high priest of Amun, someone named Mary, does not appear to have been given a successor under Amenhotep. This could be from a lack of texts, but there doesn't appear to have been a high priest of Amun until much later under Amenhotep III. And no tomb of Mary's successor has been found. There was also no high priest of Amun known under Amenhotep's successor, Thutmose IV. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer doesn't believe an exodus happened in the 15th century. But he does note something interesting about the cult of the later heretic king, Akhenaten. Akhenaten was the pharaoh who tried to impose monotheism onto Egypt and forbid the traditional polytheism of Egypt's past. However, his cult did not spring up instantly once he took the throne. It probably started out more as henotheistic, with focusing on worshipping the sun god, and it actually had been growing a few decades earlier, and the earliest we can trace it back to is under Amenhotep II. Hoffmeyer says, H.M. Stewart observed that sun hymns enjoyed a rising popularity in the 18th dynasty, and that the universalist dogma of the Amarna hymns can be seen from the time of Amenhotep II. So, we have a likely reference to an anomaly during the reign of Amenhotep II, when he ordered the images of the Egyptian gods to be destroyed. Then, we have secondary evidence, in that it may have been the case that the office of the high priest of Amun was not allowed to continue, and that the Aten cult, which grew to become a counter-religious movement, seems to have its roots in this time period, suggesting that during the days of Amenhotep II, there was religious turmoil. However, this would be expected if there was an exodus. As Exodus 12:12 says, "On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." Egyptologists like James Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen note the plagues of Egypt were seen as attacks on the Egyptian gods by the God of Israel. If Egyptians perceived that their gods were defeated by another, and that the gods failed to protect them from plagues, executing judgment on their statues and images would be a likely result. Some Egyptians may even look for new religious ideas in a cult that would one day gain power under Akhenaten. Of course, when we read Exodus 12, it also mentions the 10th plague of Egypt, when God struck down all the firstborn. And also correlating with this point in Egyptian history, Amenhotep's oldest son did not inherit the throne, nor was he the oldest son of his father. Inscriptions that date to the 24th year of Thutmose III state someone known as Prince Amenemhat was the oldest son of Thutmose III. He obviously died before his father, and the throne passed to Amenhotep. However, Amenhotep's successor was also not his oldest son. The pharaoh that succeeded him was Thutmose IV. And there's a famous stele called the Dream Stele, which says that when Thutmose IV was a child, the sun god came to him and said he would get to rule Egypt if he would uncover the Sphinx. Egyptologists doubt the story, but they point out it was probably a piece of propaganda to explain why Thutmose IV became the pharaoh. If he was the oldest son, his reign would just have been expected, and he would not need an explanation for how it came to pass. So Egyptologists agree, Thutmose IV was probably not the oldest son of Amenhotep, or the expected heir, which is why the Dream Stele had to be commissioned, to put divine providence behind his reign. However, if you do your homework, you'll find that there are some texts that attest to another Amenhotep, which Redford refers to as Prince B, or Prince Amenhotep. This prince was the son of Amenhotep II. Based on inscriptions from the Sphinx Temple, he would have most likely lived past Amenhotep's 9th year, and therefore past the Exodus. However, Prince B is also not referred to as the king's oldest son, which was a common practice for Egyptians to do. Egyptians also tried not to name their oldest the same as themselves, because they instituted something called co-regencies, meaning that when the pharaoh was getting old, he would appoint his son as a co-regent, so he could learn how to rule Egypt before his father died. So it could get quite confusing having two pharaohs with the same name. Thus it would be more likely that Amenhotep II would not name his oldest son Amenhotep as well. So Donald Redford, who doesn't believe an Exodus happened, says something strikingly peculiar about this. The fact that he was named Amenhotep like his father might be taken to indicate that he was not the firstborn, that an older son named Thutmose had been born to Amenophis II. It would be necessary to assume, however, that this Thutmose had passed away in childhood without leaving any trace. So let's recap. The end of the 15th dynasty and the rise of the 18th dynasty correlates to the political changes we see in the book of Exodus. The Egyptian fear of Semitic overpopulation also correlates with this political time. Later on, during the reign of Thutmose III, the tomb of the Vizier Reichmir shows foreign slaves making bricks, correlating to the slave labor described in Exodus. Egyptologists note Amenhotep II stood out as arrogant, prideful, and merciless. His oldest son did not inherit the throne, nor was he the oldest son of his father. There is evidence of religious turmoil, political and military weakening. There was a sudden demand for new chariots and a new slave labor workforce. And to obtain these slaves and chariots, they launched the campaign during an unusual time period. And this all correlates well with what we should expect to find if there was an exodus during Amenhotep's reign. Now, some who are still skeptical at this point might want to ask, if there was an exodus of Semites who were the ancestors of the nation of Israel, where is the evidence of foreigners living in Egypt and suddenly leaving? The book of Exodus says the Hebrews set out from the city of Ramesses. We know where this site is thanks to archaeological excavations. However, during the days of the 18th dynasty, it is doubtful this site was called Ramesses. But as we noted, updating place names in the Hebrew Bible was a standard practice, and it is frequently employed in Genesis. In Genesis, the land is called Ramesses, and most scholars accept this wasn't the name when Israel moved into the land of Goshen. So the city could have also been updated and it wasn't necessarily the name when the Exodus occurred. Prior to that, the traditional name for the site was Avaris. Manfred Bietek has led excavations on the site for years and is the leading expert on ancient Avaris. Occupation of the site goes back to the 11th dynasty. When the Hyksos took over, Avaris seems to have been their capital. When the 18th dynasty took over, they didn't abandon the site. Instead, they occupied it, forming a new royal citadel. They also used the site as a military base and harbor for launching campaigns into Canaan. In fact, the city seems to have been transformed into an enormous store city for conquest into Canaan. And it was most likely used for this purpose under Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. Bietek also notes that when the Hyksos were kicked out, there is no evidence of a mass exodus. There is mounting evidence that a large part of this population stayed on in Egypt and served their new overlords with their skills and experience, which were in demand in their host country. He notes Canaanite-style artifacts can be found at the site of Avaris during the New Kingdom, and from the Hyksos period on, there is an unbroken continuity right up to the Thutmose side period. There were also no pig bones found at this site. So the Semitic people who were there during the Hyksos period seem to have stayed there right up through part of the 18th dynasty. However, under the 18th dynasty, it doesn't appear the people were treated well. There is some evidence of ritual executions conducted on young males at the site. The site was also in use through the reign of Thutmose III, but there is no evidence of the site being occupied after the reign of Amenhotep II. The Canaanite people who were there seem to have moved elsewhere or left. To quote Bietek, it was in use from the early reign of Thutmose III until the reign of Amenephis II, perhaps even until the end of the king's reign. We hear nothing of Peru Nefer in the text after the reign of Amenhotep II, when the site was abandoned until the Amarna period. Bietek suggests it could have been abandoned at the end of Amenhotep's reign, or during it. However, Douglas Petrovich has argued the evidence at the site indicates it could not have been abandoned at the end of his reign, and was more likely abandoned somewhere in the middle. This is due in part to a lack of scarab evidence for Thutmose IV. Remember that pharaohs would institute co-regencies with their heir when they were beginning to approach death. If the site was still in use up until the end of Amenhotep's reign, we should expect to find some scarab evidence of Thutmose IV. The name of the harbor is also not included in text after Amenhotep II. Also, the site was mainly used for launching military operations into Canaan, and as we noted before, Thutmose IV did launch minor policing operations into Canaan, so it's unlikely he would have abandoned the site when it would have been useful for him during his campaigns. And pottery found in some of the burial sites best correlates to the time of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. So the site was most likely abandoned before Thutmose IV, and would thus indicate it happened sometime during Amenhotep's reign, probably around the time when the peace treaty was signed with the Mitanni Empire and the campaigns into Canaan ceased, correlating with what we should expect to find if there was an exodus of Semites. The evidence shows that Semitic people, who were there since the Hyksos period, suddenly abandoned the site during the reign of Amenhotep II. Some might attempt to argue this could not be the exodus of the biblical Hebrews, because Bietek also notes we have found evidence that the Canaanite population was worshipping an array of gods at the time of the occupation. But this is not inconsistent with the biblical report. In fact, we should expect to find this, because the book of Joshua explicitly says the Hebrews were worshipping other gods while in Egypt. The Exodus, according to the biblical text, is one of the things that God used to bring Israel back to worshipping only Him, which was a process that took several generations to correct. So finding evidence of Canaanite polytheism at Avaris should be expected if the biblical account is accurate. BTEC also notes some additional, peculiar features of when Avaris was abandoned. One is that we're not sure why the site was abandoned, but the most likely explanation is because of a plague. A plague, such as the one documented for Avaris in the late Middle Kingdom, and associated with Avaris in later traditions, appears to be the most likely solution to this problem, although it cannot be proven at this time. The plagues inflicted upon Egypt, as recorded by the Book of Exodus, were a combination of various natural disasters, most of which would not leave behind any evidence. There are reasonable explanations for how some of these could have played out, like for example the darkness could have been caused by a volcanic eruption from nearby Arabia, but such a thing would be hard to prove. The Nile turning to blood could have been caused by an algae bloom in a Nile estuary. That could have triggered a chain reaction, causing species like frogs to come out of the river, and resulting in the death of fish and amphibians, bringing things like flies and disease. The only indication of something like this happening is in the Ipuwer papyrus. Most scholars date it to an earlier time period, but it does speak of the Nile turning to blood, which could have been a natural event that happened again during the Exodus. Kenneth Kitchen suggests Ipuwer in the Exodus account could be referring to the same type of natural disaster. More recently, Titus Kennedy has made a case the linguistic evidence of Ipuwer dates to the time period of the 18th dynasty, and could be a poetic account of the plagues of the Exodus, in the same way Psalm 78 and 105 are poetic accounts of the Exodus. But because of the poetic nature of Ipuwer, it is hard to really nail down a definitive answer on the nature of the text. But there is some evidence it linguistically can fit with the same time period of the Exodus. But of course, it would be difficult to find hard evidence for the plagues, because they would not have made an archaeological mark that would have lasted for several millennia, and Egypt rarely admitted embarrassments or defeats. However, a more interesting find at Avaris is that there was a large grave of young sheep and goats, also known as lambs, that dates to the time of the abandonment or shortly after. Even more peculiar is BTEC notes the lambs died young, most only about 1 year old, and were buried with care, which is what we should expect to find if there was a Passover ritual that utilized the blood of lambs. God told Israel to utilize young lambs in their first year for the Passover, and then to care for the carcasses so as to not break any bones. And surprisingly, we find graves that match this description that dates to the time of the abandonment of Avaris. Thus, it seems probable we have found evidence of the first Passover. BTEC says, "It seems highly unusual that shepherds would bury the often tiny animals with such care in deep pits, rather than leaving the corpses as prey for dogs or birds, or just throwing them into the river, the common practice in Egypt to this day. Why the bodies were disposed of so carefully cannot easily be explained. The reason surely was not only out of hygienic considerations. The animals, both young and adult, were as a rule bedded down with care, not simply thrown into the pits. The shepherds obviously not only cared for their livestock, but also for their dead animals." BTEC goes on to note the likely candidates as to who performed these animal burials were Asiatic nomadic shepherds from Sinai or beyond. In other words, they probably were the same Canaanite people who lived there during the Hyksos period and remained during the 18th dynasty, until they abandoned the site during the reign of Amenhotep II. There is also some evidence that Asiatics, who were responsible for the introduction of wool sheep from Asia into Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, were still employed as shepherds during the New Kingdom. We may therefore assume that the shepherds tending the Egyptian institutionalized herds of small livestock in the eastern delta also may have originated among the culturally elusive nomads living on the eastern fringes of the delta. They may have been the Shashu, a people known from the Egyptian texts from the 18th dynasty onward. But what is interesting is in a later inscription, Egyptians associated the Shashu with the god Yahweh. Archaeologist Titus Kennedy recently went to investigate an Egyptian temple in northern Sudan, An inscription that dates to around 40 to 50 years after this event refers to the Shashu of Yahweh dwelling in the desert. Kennedy notes there's no land determinative, and therefore Yahweh is probably a personal name, not a place name. And so the Shashu of Yahweh might be the first reference to Israel during their wandering period. So the burial of lambs and sheep at Avaris has similarities to the Shashu and might be a cultural connection. Even without this last possible connection, what we have at the site of Avaris lines up extremely well with what the book of Exodus records. The people who abandoned Avaris under Amenhotep II are very likely to be the Hebrews of the Exodus. The evidence shows Semitic people who lived under the Hyksos remained at the site that would later be called Ramesses. They were treated harshly, lacked evidence of pig domestication, and likely would have been involved in building store cities, so the Egyptians could launch campaigns into Canaan. Exodus records the Hebrews remained after the dynasty change, were treated harshly, and built store cities. Avaris was abandoned by the Canaanite people, and they left behind a large grave that contained many young lambs that were buried with care. In Exodus, we read of the Passover, which took place just before they left, when doorposts were marked with the blood of lambs, and they were told to take care of the bodies as to not break any bones. And BTEC says this group might have associations with the Shashu, who the Egyptians might be identifying with the god Yahweh. And of course, as we noted earlier, around the same time, Amenhotep decided Egypt needed a large new slave workforce, along with new chariots and weapons, as well as seeking retaliation against the Egyptian gods, military and political weakening, and there are other correlations from the reign of Amenhotep that align with the Exodus. The external evidence we should expect to find, if there was an historical Exodus, all seems to exist, and surprisingly, it all converges to a period under the reign of Amenhotep II. Now, some skeptics might suggest that these events do not necessarily prove an Exodus, and alternative explanations could be proposed. Perhaps there really was no peace treaty, or perhaps Amenhotep's willingness to sign the treaty was a result of something else, and the religious turmoil may have happened later during his reign and was unrelated, and perhaps his oldest son just died of natural causes. Why connect all of this with an Exodus event? Well, for one, we have a textual account handed down to us that binds all of this circumstantial evidence together, the book of Exodus. If the account of the Exodus did not exist, you could argue there's no reason to connect all this together. However, we were able to explain why the account of the Exodus exists, along with all these anomalies from the reign of Amenhotep II, which correspond to when the Bible says the Exodus took place. So we can account for all this data with one explanation, instead of several different explanations that lack textual data. So Occam's razor can be invoked to argue the Exodus theory is less ad hoc than alternative theories that try to explain these anomalies with a collection of different explanations. And again, this explanation can also account for why the book of the Exodus was written. It goes back to an historical event, and we can find where it lines up in the Egyptian record. But if this is true, then there should be some internal evidence in the Pentateuch that shows it came from a group that originated in Egypt, demonstrating that the account of Exodus goes back to an historical people group from that time period. Well, in fact, several biblical scholars have noted there are several internal clues that show the book of Exodus doesn't bear the markers of later forgers, but contains several internal indicators that shows the account goes back to an historical people group who have knowledge of the Egyptian language, customs, and the culture. Benjamin Noonan notes the language used in the book of Exodus to Numbers contains a significant amount of Egyptian loanwords. There are a total of 27 and a total of 381 different occurrences. Specifically, the book of Exodus contains 26 loanwords and 333 occurrences. Outside of these three books, and within the rest of the Hebrew Bible, there are only 51 Egyptian loanwords and 450 occurrences, for a much larger section of the Bible. Given the ratio of distribution, there is a much smaller proportion of Egyptian loanwords in the rest of the corpus, when compared to the books that would be expected to have more affinity with an Egyptian past. Noonan says, when one compares the above data, it becomes evident that the Exodus and wilderness traditions contain a significantly higher proportion of Egyptian loanwords than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. From the standpoint of contact linguistics, this observation indicates that the Exodus and wilderness narratives, especially the narratives of the book of Exodus, exhibit greater Egyptian influence than the remainder of the Hebrew Bible. Noonan also compares this ratio in Exodus to books written later, such as Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These books have been shown to have old Iranian influence, given they reflect time periods of heavy Persian influence. However, these books contain 26 Iranian loanwords, with 82 occurrences. The relative frequency of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus and wilderness traditions is significantly higher than the relative frequency of old Iranian loans in Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Some might argue that early Canaanite cultures were heavily influenced by Egyptian intervention throughout the New Kingdom. But when we compare Hebrew to other Canaanite languages, we again find more Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative than we do in other languages. There are very few Egyptian loanwords in Ugaritic, and only one in Phoenician. Moabite, Ammonite, and Edomite contain no examples of Egyptian loanwords. Old Aramaic contains 2, and as time progresses to Imperial Aramaic, you get an abundance of Egyptian loanwords. However, the loanwords mostly show up in Egyptian Aramaic texts that were from Egypt. Even with that, Noonan notes, the ratio of occurrences of Egyptian loanwords to total word counts, i.e. the relative frequency of Egyptian loans, is significantly higher in the Exodus and wilderness narratives than it is in Imperial Aramaic. Thus, the high amount of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative is unique with regards to regional languages within the Levant. The question, of course, is how and when did the Egyptian influence occur on the Hebrew language? Noonan argues based on the type of some of the loanwords we find in the book of Exodus, the likely time for linguistic borrowing to occur would be during the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Some of the loanwords in Hebrew are feminine nouns that contain a specific ending, yet this ending dropped off in later times in Egypt. So the most likely time for this influence to occur is during the Bronze Age, when the Bible says the Hebrews were in Egypt. Thus, the Exodus narrative contains remnants of the Egyptian language of the Bronze Age, or the period of the Middle Kingdom to New Kingdom. James Hoffmeyer notes many of the personal names of the Pentateuch reflect the same time period of Egypt, and most likely have Egyptian roots. The name Moses is most likely a Hebraized version of the Egyptian name that shows up in names like Thutmose or Ramesses. Hoffmeyer suspects there's bilingual wordplay happening in the book of Exodus, prescribing meaning to his name in chapter 2. Merari, son of Levi, is only attested among Hebrew names in the Semitic world, but was a common Egyptian name of the Middle Kingdom. Phineas is also most likely an Egyptian name that means Nubian. The name Asir might derive from the god Osiris. Several other names have Egyptian roots. Now, Richard Hess notes many names could instead potentially have West Semitic origin. However, West Semitic names have a strong presence in Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom. Hess also notes the names still reflect an early origin. All of these names have roots attested in the 2nd millennium BC. There is no personal name that appears only in the 1st millennium BC, and thus there is none that can be used to support the argument for the narratives being a fictional account written by scribes in the middle of the 1st millennium BC. By itself, this is a significant finding, for it affirms the names as appropriate to the time when the events of the Exodus and the surrounding narratives took place. It would be remarkable if scribes writing much later had not placed among 40 names some that were unique to their later period, and not attested in the 2nd millennium BC. Another piece of data suggests a late Bronze Age origin for the account of the Exodus. The use of the name Ramesses for the city and the land of Goshen are probably updated names by the time Israel settled in Canaan. But by the 11th century BC, P-Ramesses was dismantled and the stones were moved to the new capital Tanis. The city was abandoned and Ramesses doesn't show up in later sources to refer to Tanis. So scholars note the Exodus narrative seems to have been set and finalized, at least as an oral tradition, before the dismantling of Ramesses. This is not to say the book of Exodus originally had the word Avaris and was later changed, but that when the Hebrews began to preserve their history centuries later, they referred to the site by its current name, which at that time would have been Ramesses, which would indicate when the account of the Exodus began being written down or orally finalized. Furthermore, later texts like Psalm 78 refer to the area by the 1st millennium BC name, the field of Zoan. The book of Exodus does not use this later name. Manfred Betek says, "This shows that the presence of the toponym Ramesses in the books of Genesis and Exodus must have been adopted from a tradition older than the 3rd Intermediate and Saite periods. The said changes in the physical and political landscape of the Eastern Delta, including new major centers and toponyms, were incorporated only later into the Bible, while the start of the itinerary in Exodus reflects the topographical conditions of the Ramesside period." So Exodus retained an older name, supporting the case the account of the Exodus goes back to memories from the 2nd millennium. Hoffmeyer also notes other toponyms can date back to the New Kingdom period time. We also see customs and cultural connections throughout the Pentateuch. Exodus 15, also called the Song of the Sea, is considered to be one of the oldest written texts in the Bible based on linguistics, but it has more affinity with Egyptian customs. It is ascribed to a particular voice, namely Moses, which was a more common theme in Egyptian hymns. The poetic nature of referring to God's right hand being used to destroy an enemy matches more with how Egyptian texts speak of pharaohs defeating enemies with their right arm than how the phrase would be used in Akkadian and Ugaritic texts. In fact, Joshua Berman points out the doublet nature of Exodus 14 to 15, which covers the account of the crossing of the Red Sea, is similar to what we see with Egyptian accounts of battles, like the Kadesh inscription, where we see 2 accounts of the battle, a longer account and a smaller version known as the Bulletin. Berman also notes the Red Sea crossing account shares many similar themes and a structure to what we find in Egyptian accounts of battles, like the Kadesh inscription, which were based on historical events. In other words, Exodus is written in an Egyptian-like manner to preserve historical information. This is not to say one copied the other. Instead, both likely follow the same literary structure because they both came from an ancient Egyptian culture and are both likely trying to preserve historical information. Donald Redford even has to admit about the Exodus as a whole. The text does not look like mythology, at least on the definition of the latter, as a timeless event set in the world of the gods. The biblical writer certainly thinks he is writing datable history. He also thinks it is possible to locate this event on the ground and packs his narrative with topographical detail. Exodus is also familiar with Egyptian themes and customs. It refers to God's strong and mighty hand, or outstretched arm, being used to defeat Egypt, which is a common theme in Egyptian texts that refer to the pharaoh defeating his enemies with his strong arm and power. Another important thing to note is the pharaohs are not named in Genesis through Exodus. As unfortunate as it is that the authors never named the pharaohs in the Pentateuch, this appears to be a common Egyptian theme in the second half of the 2nd millennium BC. F.J. Yurko has pointed out that the pharaoh's name is often omitted in administrative documents. James Hoffmeyer says, "From its inception until the 10th century, the term pharaoh stood alone, without juxtaposed personal name. In subsequent periods, the name of the monarch was generally added. The usage of pharaoh in Genesis and Exodus does accord well with the Egyptian practice from the 15th through the 10th centuries." We see the same thing in the biblical texts. The pharaohs are not named in the early history, but in later texts, we see pharaohs named. So the books of the Pentateuch correlate with the literary practices of Egypt from the 2nd millennium BC, whereas later texts, like the books of Kings and Chronicles, better fit with literary practices of the first millennium BC. Hoffmeyer notes an interesting line in Exodus. It says, "Hail destroyed the flax and the barley, for the barley was in the ear, and the flax was in bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up." 18th dynasty paintings show that barley and flax were grown together, but wheat was typically harvested a month or so after that. Hoffmeyer says, "This attention in Exodus to the period when crops matured shows that the writers of these narratives had an excellent knowledge of the Egyptian agricultural calendar. The presence of this type of information could hardly be the guesswork of an author, removed by a great amount of space and time from the events." Like with external data, when we look at the internal evidence, individually, none of these points would amount to much, but combined, they make a strong case the Exodus is an historical account that goes back to a time Israel had extensive knowledge of the Egyptian language, culture, and customs. If this was all a fabrication, it is unlikely the book of Exodus would coincidentally contain all of these affinities with Egyptian culture. However, if the Exodus is an accurate historical account, this is what we should expect to find, and again, the account also fits very well with the anomalies that happened during the reign of Amenhotep II. Finally, we can add another piece of data. By looking beyond the Pentateuch, we can find separate traditions that agree Israel was once in Egypt and left due to plagues and disease. Both the Roman historian Tacitus and the Egyptian historian Manetho speak of the Jews leaving Egypt a long time ago. Tacitus says the Hebrews were expelled because of a plague, and Manetho calls it an expulsion of lepers. There are similar traditions here to what we find in the earlier account within the book of Exodus, but it is unlikely Manetho or Tacitus obtained their information from biblical texts. It is more likely they're referring to other traditions that were handed down to them that speak of an Exodus from the perspective of the Egyptians. If there are multiple traditions that refer to the same event, it is unlikely they were all made up and still say the same thing. Thus, this supports the notion the book of Exodus is a record of an historical event, not a later myth. This is not to say these other accounts are as reliable. Tacitus, for example, gets the wrong time period and places the Exodus in the Third Intermediate Period. However, Manetho contains another interesting correlation. Although Josephus disagrees with him, and he seems to date the Exodus at a later time, he does say the pharaoh of the Exodus was someone named Amenophis, which is the Greek name for Amenhotep. But if Amenhotep was the pharaoh of the Exodus, why did he not die in the Red Sea? Well, it is a common belief today that the pharaoh drowned, but the Bible doesn't actually claim this. Douglas Petrovich says, Moses only states that the Lord would be honored through Pharaoh by the destruction of his army. But throughout the entire narrative of Exodus, Moses never explicitly states that Pharaoh died along with his army. He also notes the later Psalm 136 is often used to support the notion the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, but it is vague in the original Hebrew. It doesn't say the Pharaoh specifically drowned, and besides that, we're speaking of a text that was meant to be more poetic in nature. The Hebrew verb shows that God actually shook off the powerful Pharaoh and his army, who were bothersome pests that God, whose might is far greater than theirs, merely brushed away. So there is no indication in the biblical texts that Pharaoh died during the Exodus. Amenhotep II proudly sent his army across the Red Sea without going himself. Another objection is the Exodus, if taken entirely literally, would indicate the amount of Hebrews who left Egypt, and the mixed multitude who went with them, was somewhere between 2 and 5 million. This is incredibly high and unlikely. If there was that many slaves in Egypt, they could have just taken over themselves, similar to what happened with the Hyksos. But scholars have noted for years this is not actually what the Bible says. Richard Hess and Kenneth Kitchen, as well as many conservative scholars, agree the Hebrew term for 1,000 can refer to a military unit, a tribe, or a small group. Mitchell Modine also notes the census data in the Book of Numbers bears the marks of idealized figures, not the literal numbers of the actual census. And we have noted elsewhere using idealized numbers as a common Jewish theme. More realistic estimates put the Exodus at between 15,000 and 30,000 people, which fits more with the expected birth rates and numbers we see in the later Book of Judges. Many skeptics also attempt to argue that if the Exodus happened, there should be a written record of it in Egypt. After all, we have found thousands of inscriptions throughout Egypt. Surely if there was an Exodus, someone would have at least mentioned it once. But this can be addressed by simply studying the cultural and archaeological context. First, the Egyptians were not trying to write unbiased history. In their inscriptions, they were trying to promote a glorified version of themselves and their actions. Jenny Hill says, "The hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls of their temples were a useful propaganda tool of the pharaoh and the priests. As a result, they tend to give the most positive view of the current pharaoh or make implications regarding the perceived quality of a previous pharaoh, which may have been prompted more by political motivations than a desire to record the truth. Inscriptions in tombs, also in hieroglyphs, are similarly careful to paint a positive picture." Donald Redford refers to Egyptian texts several times as propaganda used to promote an idealized view of Egypt that is probably not historically accurate. William Kelly Simpson notes Egyptian texts and even the art are propagandistic and are not fair in their assessment of how events actually played out. James Hoffmeyer notes, "The reality is that pharaohs typically do not report on failures, or they turn them propagandistically into successes." Egyptologists extract bits of historical information from ancient Egyptian inscriptions, but with the understanding that the Egyptians were not at all trying to be fair, let alone record events that would have gone against their agenda. So we aren't going to find in their inscriptions an account of when their slaves managed to best them and escape into the desert while drowning an Egyptian army. Also, it should be pointed out that although we know an exorbitant amount of ancient Egyptian history, thanks to all the inscriptions they left behind, what we currently know is only a fraction of their history. Much of what existed in ancient Egypt has been lost or destroyed. Tomb raiders have routinely robbed graves throughout the ages. Many of the 18th dynasty blocks were taken and reused in 19th dynasty temples, and those stones were reused in later temples and were recycled even up into Islamic times. Natural forces over time have also weathered and eroded a lot of ancient Egyptian history, including destroying over 99% of ancient papyri. At Avaris, the site of where the Hebrews would have lived, we have found around 470 seal impressions in what was once a scriptorium. All of these documents have rotted away due to the wet conditions at that site. Some Egyptian dynasties also tried very hard to wipe out the records of previous pharaohs they despised, and sometimes were successful. For example, we know very little about the 15th dynasty of Egypt, because the later 18th dynasty destroyed their records and monuments. Even the periods we know a lot about are fragmented. We know a lot about Thutmose III because he went on several campaigns and left a lot of inscriptions boasting of his accomplishments. But we know less about his grandson, Thutmose IV, because as Peter Clayton says, our knowledge is marred by a lack of texts. So ancient Egyptian history is highly fragmented and riddled with bias. We shouldn't expect to find an inscription referencing the Exodus. And even on the tiny possibility that one did exist, it would likely have been lost with the mounds of evidence we are currently missing. But despite that, it can easily be argued, as I've done here, that there is an exorbitant amount of evidence that supports there was an exodus from Egypt. Within the archaeological record, we have evidence of foreign Semitic slaves around a site that was known later as Ramesses. The site was suddenly abandoned, and they left behind a large grave of lambs. We see evidence the pharaoh needed to replace them with a new workforce and obtain new chariots. We see this followed by a decline in Egyptian power and military might, as well as religious turmoil. Evidence shows a drastic change in the pharaoh's character, and whoever succeeded him could not have been his oldest son. We also see there is a wealth of internal evidence demonstrating the book of Exodus has affinity to Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC, instead of resembling a 1st millennium BC text that fits with the Babylonian or Persian periods. Therefore, we have an abundance of evidence to support the Exodus account. The Exodus from Egypt is not a myth. It has been discovered right when the Bible says it happened.